9 months after we buried my daughter, a $847 water bill arrived at her supposedly empty lake house. I want you to think about that for a second, friends. A property that had been sitting padlocked and dark since the day we lowered Claire into the ground. A cabin with the main water valve turned off at the meter. And yet, somehow, nearly $900 worth of water had run through those pipes. I set that bill down on my kitchen table, and for a long moment, I just sat there in the silence of a house that had felt hollow for the better part of a year. Then I picked up my car keys. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 63 years old, and for 35 years I worked as a licensed master plumber and pipe systems engineer for commercial and municipal projects across the state of Tennessee. I have laid water mains beneath interstate highways. I have pressure tested the supply systems for hospitals, schools, and high-rise apartment buildings. I know, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life reading flow rates and calculating pressure loss, exactly what a water bill is telling you. An empty house does not use water. Not a dollar's worth. Not a penny's worth. $847 means something is running in that cabin. Something large and something continuous. Claire was 29 years old when she died. A blood clot. Sudden, without warning, without the chance for a single goodbye. She went to sleep on a Wednesday night, and she simply did not wake up on Thursday morning. Her husband, Derek, was the one who called me. I remember the way his voice sounded on the phone, flat and hollow, like a man reading words off a page he did not write. I drove 3 hours to their house in the dark, and I held my son-in-law while he wept on my front porch, and I told myself that grief looked different on every person, and that I should not judge a man for the way his pain came out. The lake house had been Claire's. Her mother and I had purchased the property when Claire was 12 years old, a modest 2-bedroom cabin sitting on the eastern shore of Hartwell Lake in western South Carolina. When her mother passed 6 years ago, I signed the deed over to Claire outright. It was her inheritance, her retreat, the place where she and Derek spent their summers fishing off the dock and watching the water go still at dusk. After Claire died, Derek told me he could not bear to go back there. He said the memories were too heavy. He said he had padlocked the gate, shut off the water at the street, and left it alone until he found the emotional strength to decide what to do with it. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. So you understand why my hands went still when I looked at that bill. The account was still in Claire's name because the estate had not yet been fully settled. The mailing address had been updated to forward to my house at Derek's request, since he said he was too overwhelmed to manage the paperwork. I had been receiving and filing these forwarded documents for months, mostly the small monthly account maintenance fees that utility companies charge to keep a meter active. $12 here, $8 there. I had been writing small checks and filing them without giving them more than a glance. But $847 stopped me cold. I did not call Derek. A man who spent 3.5 decades troubleshooting hidden leaks and underground pressure failures learns very quickly that the first thing you never do is announce yourself to the problem. I folded that bill carefully, put it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, walked to the garage, and backed my truck out of the driveway into the gray November morning. The lake house was 2 hours and 40 minutes from my front door. I drove them in near silence, the heater running low, my mind sorting through the possibilities the way I used to sort through a set of pipe diagrams. Vandals, squatters, a frozen line that had burst and been running into the crawl space for months. Each option had its own logic and its own probability. By the time I turned onto the rural 2-lane that curved along the eastern shoreline, I had considered all of them. None of them fully settled right. I did not pull up to the gate. The road to Claire's property branched off a county highway and wound through about a 1/4 mile of pine and sweet gum before reaching the cabin itself. I knew a hunter's access track that cut along the northern tree line, used by deer camp trucks in the fall. I eased my pickup onto that track, killed the headlights, even though it was still afternoon, and parked behind a stand of tall pines about 300 yards from the property. I walked the rest of the way through the woods. When the tree line broke and I had a clear view of the cabin and dock, I stopped moving entirely. The main house was dark, but the small utility outbuilding behind the cabin, the one Derek and I had converted into a workshop the summer before Claire got sick, the one with its own separate water hookup for a utility sink, was not dark. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like black plastic sheeting, but the edges glowed with a warm, continuous light. And running along the exterior wall, newly installed, were two thick gray flexible hoses disappearing into a ground-level vent I had not put there. I had been a plumber long enough to recognize a dedicated water feed when I saw one. I stood in the tree line for a long time, watching. No movement outside. No vehicles visible from my angle, though the driveway curved behind the house and I could not see it fully. The light behind that black plastic sheeting did not flicker. It was steady and bright, the kind of light you need when you are doing careful, detailed work. I walked back to my truck. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off, and I thought about my daughter. Then I pulled out my phone and called Derek. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that same practiced sorrow he had worn like a coat since the funeral. I told him I had been going through some of the forwarded mail and came across what looked like an inflated water bill for the lake house. I told him I figured there was probably a slow leak somewhere in the system, maybe a running toilet or a cracked supply line in the crawl space, and I was thinking about driving down to take a look. I told him I did not want him to have to deal with it on top of everything else he was already carrying. The pause before he spoke was short, maybe 2 seconds. But friends, I have spent 35 years listening to the sounds that pipes make when pressure builds behind a closed valve. 2 seconds of silence from a man who had nothing to hide would have been 0 seconds. He told me not to bother. He said he had actually hired a local handyman to do some winterization work at the property about 6 weeks ago, running the water periodically to prevent the lines from freezing, which probably explained the high usage. He said the man's name was Gary, a reliable local fellow he had found through a neighbor. He said he should have mentioned it to me. He was sorry. Everything had just been so overwhelming. It sounded reasonable. It sounded exactly like what a grieving widower might do to protect a property in winter. Except the lake house sits at an elevation of 750 feet in a climate that rarely dips below freezing before late December, and no competent winterization technician installs thick, flexible water feeds through exterior vents and covers every window in black plastic sheeting. I told Derek that made perfect sense. I told him I was relieved it was something simple. I said goodnight, and I ended the call. Then I sat in my truck in the dark woods for another hour until I was certain no one was coming or going. I photographed the outbuilding from the tree line with my phone, capturing those exterior hoses and the glow behind the blackout plastic. Then I drove home. I went to my office, which is really just the spare bedroom with a filing cabinet and a desk, and I pulled out the folder I kept for Claire's estate documents. I had been the secondary executor, named in her will alongside Derek as co-administrator. I had the right to access every financial and property record associated with that estate. I started reading. The first thing I found was a water utility account amendment filed 4 months after Claire's death. The billing address had been changed, but there was a secondary service address listed for a secondary account branch I had never seen before. The account had been upgraded to a commercial flow rate tier, the kind of billing structure you use when your monthly consumption exceeds the residential maximum. Someone had modified my dead daughter's utility account to accommodate industrial-level water consumption, and they had done it quietly, 4 months after her funeral, on a Thursday afternoon. I needed help, not because I could not see what was happening, but because what I was looking at was larger than a plumber with a grudge and a filing cabinet could safely handle alone. I called 2 people the next morning. The first was Renata Cross. Renata had been Claire's family attorney, the woman who drafted her will and guided me through the estate paperwork. She was 61, small, precise, and possessed of a legal mind that I had seen reduce a hostile county commissioner to stuttering silence in a public hearing. When I laid out what I had found, she listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me to send her photographs of everything and to touch nothing at the property. The second call was to a man named Phil Gorecki. Phil was a former county sheriff's investigator who now worked private cases across the upstate. I had known him for 20 years, since the days when he used to call me in as a technical expert to evaluate pipe damage in insurance fraud investigations. He was methodical, quiet, and completely unbothered by gray areas. When I explained what I had seen at the lake house, he told me to meet him at a diner off the interstate the following morning. We met over coffee, and I laid out everything. The bill, Derek's story about the winterization handyman, the flexible water feeds, the blacked-out windows. Phil pulled a small notebook from his jacket and wrote without speaking for almost 5 minutes. Then he looked up at me and said that what I was describing, a converted outbuilding with dedicated water supply and light-blocking materials, matched a setup he had seen twice before in this county. He said both prior cases had involved the same core operation. He said he needed 3 days to confirm before he said anything more specific, and he told me to stay away from the property entirely. I spent those 3 days going back through every document Claire's estate had generated since her death. Renata helped me, working remotely, flagging items I might have missed. What we found, page by page, was a slow financial dismemberment that I had been too blinded by grief to notice. 8 weeks after the funeral, Derek had refinanced the lake house, pulling a home equity line of credit for $220,000 against a property that Claire had left debt-free. He was listed as sole surviving spouse and had signed as primary borrower. The notification had been mailed to his address, not forwarded to mine. I sat with that document for a very long time. My daughter had loved that property. She had spent her childhood summers there learning to swim off that dock. She had told me, the last Christmas she was alive, that she planned to pass it on to her own children someday. And 9 months after her death, the man she had trusted with everything she was had mortgaged it behind her father's back for $220,000. I knew what the money had funded. I just needed Phil to confirm it. He called on the 4th morning. His voice was steady, the way it always was when the news was serious. He told me that based on 3 nights of careful observation from the tree line, the outbuilding had been converted into a large-scale hydroponic cannabis cultivation operation. He estimated, based on the power draw, the water consumption, and the visible infrastructure, that the setup was generating somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 per harvest cycle, with multiple cycles per year. He said it was not a hobby operation. It was commercial scale, professionally built, and had likely been generating revenue for at least 6 months. He also told me who was running it. There was a second person accessing the property regularly, someone Derek was meeting there 2 or 3 nights a week. Phil had captured photographs from the tree line. The vehicle was registered to a woman named Sandra Pratt. Phil had run her background. She had 2 prior misdemeanor charges related to drug distribution, both pleaded down years ago. More importantly, she had been employed by Derek for 4 years as an office manager at his landscaping business. Phil had found her name on 3 of the business accounts Derek used. She was not just an employee, she was his operational partner. I went to my desk, and I opened the estate folder again. I looked for Sandra Pratt's name, anywhere in the paperwork. I found it in one place, a contractor invoice, dated 6 weeks after Claire's funeral, for landscaping maintenance services at the lake house property. $2,400, paid from the estate account I co-administered, which meant it had been paid with money that belonged, in part, to Claire's estate, which meant it had been paid with money that was partly mine to protect. They had used estate funds to pay the woman who was helping Derek build a drug operation on my dead daughter's land. I am not a man who has ever been given to outbursts. My ex-wife used to say I ran cool, and she did not mean it as a kindness. But sitting at that desk, in the house where I had raised my daughter, holding that invoice with Sandra Pratt's name on it, I felt something move through my chest that I had not felt since the morning Derek called to tell me Claire was gone. It was a grief so old and so deep that it had no bottom, and sitting right on top of it, cold and absolute, was a fury I had no intention of wasting. I called Renata. I told her everything Phil had confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that we needed to move carefully and quickly, because the estate remained legally open, which meant the lake house was still technically part of a contested asset pool, and if Derek moved to close the estate or transfer the property before we could establish evidence of fraud, we might lose our legal footing. She said she needed 48 hours to prepare documentation for an emergency estate freeze. She also said she was going to make a call to a federal contact she had worked with on a prior financial fraud case. I told her to make the call. In the meantime, I needed Derek to feel safe. I needed him to believe I was exactly what he had always taken me for, a quiet, aging, grieving father who had accepted the cover story about the winterization handyman and moved on. I drove to his house the following afternoon with a casserole dish. I had made a pot roast, the same meal I used to bring over in the months right after Claire's funeral, when I still believed he was a man hollowed out by loss, rather than a man building a criminal enterprise on top of it. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, hair slightly disheveled, the practiced version of bereavement he had been running on for 9 months. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me. He let me in, set the casserole on the counter, and poured us both a glass of sweet tea. We sat in his living room and talked about Claire the way we usually did, careful and soft, circling around the sharpest edges of her absence. I watched his eyes. I watched his hands. Then I mentioned, casually, as if it had just occurred to me, that I had been thinking about doing a little maintenance work on the lake house property myself over the winter. I said I was considering regrading the drainage on the south side of the lot, maybe upgrading the pressure regulator on the main supply line. I said I had some free time and it would give me something to do with my hands. The change in his posture was almost invisible. Almost. His shoulders dropped a quarter inch. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass of tea. He told me that was very thoughtful but completely unnecessary, that the handyman Gary had everything under control, and that he would hate for me to drive all the way out there for nothing. He suggested I wait until spring, when the weather would be more cooperative. I nodded and said that made good sense. On my way home, I called Phil and told him that Derek was actively protecting the property from outside inspection. Phil said he would coordinate with Renata and her federal contact to accelerate the timeline. 2 nights later, Renata called me at 11 in the evening. She told me to listen carefully and write nothing down. She said her contact, a special agent with a federal task force that handled interstate narcotics trafficking and financial fraud, had reviewed Phil's surveillance photographs and cross-referenced the property address against an existing investigation. The lake house was not operating in isolation. It was one of 3 conversion properties linked to a distribution network operating across 2 states. Derek was not the architect. He was a mid-level supplier who had been recruited by a larger operation. Sandra Pratt was the direct liaison to the network's distribution chain. The federal agent, Renata said, was very interested in what we had compiled. He was also very clear about one thing. The operation needed to be caught in the middle of an active transaction to make the charges airtight. A harvested crop, cash on hand, and both principals present at the property simultaneously. Phil coordinated with the task force over the following week. I stayed out of it. That was the hardest part. Sitting in my house with the estate folder on my desk and the lake house 2 hours and 40 minutes away, knowing what was happening on my daughter's land and having to wait. The operation was timed to coincide with the end of a harvest cycle. Phil had observed loading activity beginning on a Thursday evening, which suggested a Friday handoff. I received a call from Phil at 6:30 on a Friday morning. He said the task force was moving into position and that I had the option to be present at the perimeter or to wait for his call. He said it was entirely my choice. I put on a dark jacket, poured my coffee into a travel mug, and drove south. I arrived at the county highway turnoff at 9:15 in the morning. The federal vehicles were already in position along the tree line, blacked-out SUVs, and a command unit van parked on the Hunter's access track I had used myself just weeks earlier. A task force agent met me at my truck and escorted me to the command van. Through the van's surveillance monitor, I watched the thermal imaging feed from a drone circling silently above the property. There were 2 heat signatures in the outbuilding. Derek and Sandra, both present, both active. The arrest team moved at 9:47. I did not watch the monitors. I stepped out of the command van and stood in the tree line in the November cold, listening to the sounds of the operation. I heard the agents announce themselves. I heard the thud of the outbuilding door coming open. I heard Derek's voice, high and startled, and then the sound of compliance, the shuffling and the commands, and the metallic click of handcuffs. They brought him out in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, hands secured behind him, head down. He did not see me standing in the tree line. The agent beside him guided him toward a waiting vehicle. Sandra came out a moment later, already in handcuffs, speaking rapidly to the nearest agent in a tone I recognized as negotiation. I walked out of the trees and stood in the driveway of the property my daughter had loved. An agent I had spoken to briefly in the command van approached me. She handed me a document, an emergency estate injunction, already signed by a federal judge, freezing all transactions and transfers related to Claire's estate and the lake house property pending the outcome of the federal proceeding. She told me that the evidence recovered from the outbuilding, the crop, the distribution records, and a significant quantity of cash was more than sufficient to substantiate the federal charges. She also told me, quietly, that their financial forensics team had flagged the equity line of credit on the property and that the $220,000 Derek had pulled from the lake house was going to be clawed back as part of the fraud recovery. I thanked her. She nodded and walked back toward the outbuilding. I stood alone in the driveway for a while. The lake was visible from where I stood, gray and flat under the November sky, the dock stretching out into the still water. Claire used to sit at the end of that dock in the early morning with her coffee, watching the herons come in low over the water. She had told me once that it was the most peaceful place she had ever found. I walked down to the dock and stood at the end of it for a long time. The federal case moved faster than I expected. Derek entered a plea agreement in exchange for full cooperation against the distribution network. His testimony led to 7 additional arrests across 2 states. He received 12 years. Sandra Pratt went to trial and received 18. The network they had supplied lost 4 key suppliers in the same sweep. Renata spent the following 4 months unwinding every fraudulent transaction Derek had executed against Claire's estate. The equity line was voided. The funds he had drawn were partially recovered through asset seizure. The contractor invoice paid to Sandra Pratt out of estate funds was reversed, and the amount reimbursed from Derek's seized accounts. When the estate was finally and fully settled, the lake house came to me. I spent the winter and into the early spring doing what I know how to do, working with my hands. I tore out the converted outbuilding down to the slab and rebuilt it as a clean, simple workshop. I regraded the south drainage exactly as I had told Derek I planned to do. I replaced the pressure regulator on the main supply line, the original job the whole thing had started from. I hang the $847 water bill on the wall of that workshop, framed under glass. Not because I am proud of what happened, but because it reminds me of something I have known since my first year on the job. Cutting pipe in a crawl space under a house in Knoxville in 1989. The smallest irregularity in a system is never random. Water goes where it is directed. Money goes where it is directed. People go where they intend to go. When something does not add up, it is because someone has been working very hard to make it look like it does. Friends, I know many of you listening tonight have carried your own grief, your own betrayals, your own moments of standing in the cold wondering whether the ground beneath you is as solid as it appeared. I will tell you what my years of working below ground taught me. A compromised foundation does not announce itself. You find it by paying attention. You find it by trusting the evidence in front of you rather than the story you want to believe. And when you find it, you do not walk away. You brace the surrounding structure, and you do the work. The lake house is quiet this time of year. I go down on weekends when the weather is clear. I sit at the end of the dock in the morning with my coffee, watching the water go still, and I keep a promise I made to my daughter on the day we buried her, that everything she loved would be looked after. Have you ever had a single piece of overlooked mail change the entire course of something you thought you understood? Have you ever discovered that grief was being used as a weapon against your ability to see clearly? If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next story. I will be right here.